everyone, and welcome to this video where I reflect on what we've been studying about the origin of the universe. As you've been watching these videos and reading these articles, I've been doing the same. In fact, I actually did it twice. I read them once to make sure I knew what to include, and then I did it a second time to take notes. So if there's anything that you're like, man, I can't believe Mr. Fisher made me read this or watch this, listen, I did it twice. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up my notes from what I watched and read, and I've kind of summarized them. I'm going to put that up on my screen, and I'm just going to go through those notes, share my reflections with you. And then at the end, if you look at the description of this video, which I hope to post on YouTube, you'll see a link. That will take you to my full notes. So if you want to see everything I wrote down as I read and as I watched to compare with what you got out of this, that's the spot to go. This will be a summary, and still, the video is going to get a little long. I'm hoping it'll be well under an hour, but we'll see. So let's get started right now. Let me just pull up my notes on my computer here. And we'll start with the Origins of the Universe 101 from National Geographic, the first video you probably watched. In that video, the narrator defines the universe as all matter, space, time, and life. And they divide, interestingly, attempts to explain where matter, space, time, and life came from into scientific theories and creation myths. And I think language is important here. Notice right off the hop, this secular resource wants to classify things in terms of scientific inquiry and creation myths, stories, fables, if you will. I think that's something that we should be careful about, or at least I want to be careful about, the idea that there's science over here and creation over there. I'm not sure that that's helpful. There's a lot of Christians I know who love science and who are trying to study the origin of the universe scientifically. I don't know those who are doing it in terms of on the front lines, but I know people who love that sort of thing. So anyways, I just wanted to point out the idea of scientific theories and creation myths being totally separate, I think, is a misrepresentation. I think there's a crossover between people's religious views and scientific information, and your worldview influences the way you do science. And what you discover as you do science influences your worldview. The two work together. They're not competing categories, in my view. What else did I want to mention? Oh, they said that the Big Bang Theory is the most widely accepted theory of the origin of the universe. And I just wrote down, is that really true? Here's what I mean. I wonder if what they're saying is amongst the scientific community in North America, this is the most widely accepted view. I mean, if you go to India and you're in a Hindu dense population, do they believe the Big Bang Theory? There's a lot of people in India. So I guess my point is, I'm not sure if they speak on behalf of the world when they say this is the most widely accepted theory, or if they're just speaking kind of on behalf of maybe a smaller community that they have in mind. So I would quibble with that claim and want to clarify what they really mean. In the video, they claim that the universe began as a hot and infinitely dense point a few millimeters wide, and this singularity, as they call it, exploded 13.7 billion years ago, creating all matter, energy, space, and time. Questions that I had as I listened to this: how can the singularity be a few millimeters wide if there's no space yet? I wasn't quite sure how to make sense of that. And even if that were possible, where did this singularity thing come from? I mean, even if it is easier to think of a small dot and then everything, as opposed to everything just always being here, like, where did that small dot come from? I don't think we get around how we get something from nothing if we just say everything was really small and now it's really big. We still have something no matter what its size is. I'd love to know, they mentioned in the video that there are countless questions that remain. I'd love to know what those are. And it feels a little strong, especially when you're saying you have countless questions, to end the video by saying it's only a matter of time before these long sought after answers emerge. If you have countless questions, and this is still a theory, and obviously, as we know as Christians, there are a lot of people who push back on this, both in Christian communities and outside, as we'll see. It seems a little presumptuous to say, hey, it's only a matter of time before you figure this out. I don't think it's quite so cut and dried. Now, this is more of an explanatory video than one that argues, so maybe there's more detail, more argumentation for all of this that they would share. But even so, I think there are some holes that I'd like to learn more about. So that's the first video. That's Origins of the Universe 101. Now, next, we have God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. This is with Dr. William Lane Craig, and he assumes or makes the claim that modern thought believes the universe had a beginning. I think he's basing that on, as he talks about later, that kind of balloon illustration where we see expansion. So if we trace that back, even as secular people, we would see that we reach a point of beginning, that it starts at a size and then becomes larger. He made a claim that out of nothing, nothing comes. I think that's helpful. I think that's logical and true. And I liked his illustration of the magician in the hat. Like when you watch a magician pull a bunny out of a hat, you're seeing an illusion. There's no bunny there before, and now there's a bunny. But in the idea of the universe coming out of nothing, there isn't a magician, there isn't a hat, there isn't a secret compartment, there's not a wand, there's no one and nothing to create everything out of nothing. So the problem becomes much more complicated, or at least much less understandable, really. You almost run into a logical issue, as we'll see as we go through this, about how can you possibly get something out of nothing? If nothing is not anything, there's nothing there to create something. And that becomes an issue that I don't think any of the secular representations I read during this self-study really addressed head on and got past. Dr. Craig also talks about quantum vacuums, and we'll talk more about those in a few minutes, but he describes them as a sea of energy and violent activity governed by physical laws. And he describes them that way to express quantum vacuums are not nothing, the way we think of a vacuum being absolutely nothing, or at least nothing but empty space. Quantum vacuums have energy and activity and physical laws. There is something already there, so you can't use a quantum vacuum to explain how everything came from nothing, because a quantum vacuum is not nothing. Then towards the end of his video, I really enjoyed and appreciated his pointing to some of the properties that the cause of the universe must have. So for example, it must be uncaused. It must be eternal. It must be able to exist forever so that it can be there before the universe begins. It must be immaterial. Because physical things, if we're saying that physical things had a beginning, whatever created them can't be physical, otherwise there would have already been physical things. So we need something spiritual or immaterial that then creates what is physical. That's the only way the universe can have a beginning. Non-temporal, that is, able to exist without time. If time begins at the beginning of the universe, and some but not all would argue that it does, then before there's time, you need a God who can exist without time. Changeless. I didn't really understand that one, to tell you the truth. Why the creation of the universe points to God being changeless, but maybe I would if I watched the video again or did some research. Enormously powerful. We get this huge universe where there once was nothing. And personal. The idea there being that we need someone or something that can choose to act. If it was impersonal, like a machine or a robot, then when certain conditions are in place, it would have to create. Just the same way that when you hit your keyboard, the programming in your keyboard means if I hit the letter T key, a T will show up on my screen. It has to happen. The computer can't choose to press a T or not, or to put a T on the screen or not when I press it. It must do it. If that were the case with the creation of the universe, something that didn't have a choice, wasn't personal, would have to create when those conditions were met for creation. And so if the conditions for creation, I'm getting a bit tongue twisted, but I hope you get the point. If the conditions for creation had always existed, something that's not personal would have had to make right away. But a personal being who could make decisions could decide when it was right, to use a word that doesn't really work when there's no time, but you get the idea, when it was right to start creating. And so God must be, or the cause of the universe rather, must be personal, must be able to choose now is the time to kick things off. I think these qualities make sense. Uncaused, immaterial, non-temporal, enormously powerful and personal, and maybe changeless. And they sure sound like God. Although I will say, I think the point needs to be made that this doesn't necessarily prove the existence of the biblical God. It just proves the existence of some personal being outside of the physical reality, or above it, if you will. transcending it. And that lines up with the biblical God, although other religions may claim that that lines up with the gods they worship too. A question that I had as I listened to this was, how would a secular scientist respond to the claim that quantum vacuums aren't actually nothing? In all the videos, I didn't really see a good response, but I would like to give them a chance to explain what they really mean. If a quantum vacuum has energy and physical laws and so on, what do they mean when they say it's nothing? Do they have an explanation? I didn't hear one, but I would like to give them just a chance to understand what they're getting at. And maybe if not, to help them see, yeah, we really shouldn't call a quantum vacuum nothing. So the video was short and sweet, but generally solid, I said in my summary. Next, God's word on the origin of the universe. So just a few highlights. First of all, I was really just impressed all over again with how many different spots in the Bible talk about creation or reference it. It's not just Genesis, and it's not just, here and there. It's actually all throughout the Old and New Testament. That was really cool for me as a believer. Here are some things that stood out to me. God created the heavens and the earth. From everlasting to everlasting, God is God. His eternality, I think, is what's in view there. God made all things. He alone, by himself, stretched out the heavens and spread out the earth by himself, or by myself, the text says. Nothing was made without Jesus. I don't have the references for these things, but these are all from those passages. And what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. So it would seem from this that the Bible very clearly says that God created everything and that nobody helped him. That is, nobody outside of the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, helped with the creation. I think the Bible says that in multiple places, and that seemed to be the thrust. God made and no one else. God alone made creation. I think people disagree about a whole lot of things that have to do with creation, especially when it comes to how God did it. Right? And people interpret text different ways and argue back and forth. And we've tried to not get into that because it's not the point of what we're studying right now. But I mention that to make this point. I think the Bible is crystal clear that God created and that he did it by himself. I don't think that we can really argue with that based on what I was reading as I did the self-study from Scripture. It's just over and over again coming through. So hopefully that's a foundation we can build on as Christians to reach unity and understanding as we differ maybe on some other things. Next, we had the video, What Triggered the Big Bang, from How the Universe Works. It's similar to the National Geographic explanation in many ways. One little difference, they say instead of saying the singularity was a few millimeters, they say it was smaller than an atom, which is not that big. It's much smaller than that. I really liked how they questioned in this video. Too often you don't see secular scientists questioning themselves and questioning the Big Bang, and this was really neat. I'm assuming, when I say secular, that not all of them are Christians. Maybe some are, but it would seem that at least some aren't. I don't know that for a fact. It just seems to be the tone of the video. But here are some things they said that really impressed me. They said the Big Bang is just one explanation. They said there are details of the theory that haven't been figured out. They said the Big Bang could be wrong. Like, they who believe the Big Bang say the Big Bang could be wrong. And they said, we don't fully understand the first few paragraphs of the story of the origin of the universe, which is interesting because that's exactly the part we're talking about. If you don't understand that, it's hard to understand, hard to make an argument that it wasn't God who did it. But I appreciate their honesty. I'd love to know more about some of what they mean by that. But it's just refreshing to hear them say, hey, it's possible that we secular scientists who believe in the Big Bang Theory are wrong. This was cool. No bang. The Big Bang wasn't big and it didn't bang. I loved how they brought that up, right? It wasn't big because in the theory it starts very small. And it didn't bang because in the theory there's no air at that time and you need air for sound to propagate, for sound to move. That's how the sound is getting from my lips to the microphone right now and from your speakers to your ear, or from your headphones to your ears, as the case may be. Without sound, there was no bang. So the Big Bang wasn't big and it didn't bang. And I think I read somewhere, maybe in our self-study, that the Big Bang was actually originally a term used to mock this theory. Big Bang was supposed to be like kind of like a nickname, kind of a way to tease. And those who believe the theory have kind of now turned it into their badge of honor for themselves. I thought that was interesting. Towards the end, the Big Bang theory, this video mentioned some impossible problems with the Big Bang Theory, and I'd just like to know what those are. That was interesting to me. It looked like the video was going to go on. That's as long as that YouTube video was. but maybe the original gets into some of those problems. I don't know. I'd love to know more about the large-scale homogeneity of the universe and how it relates to the Big Bang Theory. Remember from chemistry, homogeneous, heterogeneous? Homogeneous meaning the same, heterogeneous meaning different. They said that kind of the universe looks on a large scale level at a kind of a bird's eye view. It looks similar all over. And they didn't really get into what that exactly how that connects to the Big Bang Theory. I'd just like some more information about that. I'd also like to know more about redshift. What exactly is redshift? I did a bit of my own independent research, actually. That wasn't part of this um, study for us. And I learned some things about what it is, and there are actually different theories about what it could be. One theory is, I think the video probably said, is that it's what happens when light is coming from sources that are moving away from us. But there are actually other theories about what redshift might be, and a lot of different viewpoints on how reliable it is as an indicator of anything, let alone the expansion of the universe. So that was interesting to me, just to do a little research, get more informed, but I'd love to learn still more. Next, let's move. We're trying to keep rolling here. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go back to the video recording, and I'm just going to check my time. How are we doing? Okay, we're about 15 minutes in. We're doing pretty well here. I think we'll be 40 minutes or less total. Stick with me here. We're going to do this thing. I hope this is helpful. Really, I just hope you see I'm being honest about how I feel about what we've watched. I'm not just trying to give like the right answer. I'm trying to give credit where credit's due, and hopefully this is a good review for you. I know I'm talking fast. So hopefully you're able to understand me, but I'm trying to get through it quickly because I don't want to take up your whole afternoon or morning or whenever it is. Next, we had an open letter to the scientific community. Really neat to see all those signatures. Go back and check them if you didn't notice. PhDs and other scientists, presumably many of them not Christians, calling out the Big Bang Theory and saying, hey, we've got issues with this. I liked or appreciated hearing about the growing number of hypothetical entities that haven't been observed. They mentioned inflation and dark matter and dark energy, and I would just love to learn more about what those are and whether maybe in the kind of time between when this letter was written and now we know more about whether these things might exist or definitely don't exist. But I thought it was interesting to say, look, you've got some hypothetical things, some things you're thinking are probably there, even though we don't know that they're there. And you need them because if those things don't exist, you have these kind of impossible, fatal, I think the article said, contradictions between the observations that astronomers and studiers of space are making and your theory. You need those things. Otherwise, there's an issue and conflict between what we're seeing in the universe now and your theory of how it all began. And I thought that was really that's a bold claim. That's a big issue. So I'd be curious to know how that conversation has developed, if any further evidence has come one way or the other. Another thing they said that I thought was interesting was, sorry, just one second here. Let me make sure I've covered that other point. Yep. Was that the Big Bang Theory, according to this letter, has become way more flexible as more evidence surfaces so that it still works. It's kind of like, here's our theory of the Big Bang. Oh, but we found this information out here, so okay, let's kind of adjust it. And oh, there's a bit of information over here, so we'll adjust it again. And all of a sudden, you get this kind of big theory in which practically anything can fit because you've tried to save the theory by kind of creating almost loopholes that explain some of these things. Now, I think in one sense it's okay to do that because as we get more evidence, we should be kind of adjusting our understanding accordingly. But on the other hand, it is a little troubling when you keep kind of adjusting your theory just to kind of preserve it, and you try to force the evidence kind of find a spot to fit in your theory as you adjust it, as opposed to saying, hey, maybe this evidence means my theory needs to be reconsidered altogether. What's next? Oh yes, they mentioned plasma cosmology and steady state models of the origin of the universe. It was neat to see, even within science and the scientific community, if we use the term for a second, assuming that means non-Christian, although it doesn't necessarily need to mean that. It was interesting to see that even in these secular groups, there's disagreement about how the origin of it. It's not like every scientist believes one thing. Who's not a Christian believes one thing. Every scientist who's not a Christian believes one thing. It's not like that, is what I'm trying to say. But rather, even within unbelieving scientists, there are different views of the origins. The Big Bang Theory does not rule them all. That was interesting to me. It helps us get beyond that kind of science over here and faith over here kind of thing to say, no, no, no. Even within science, there are different perspectives and a lot of disagreement. It sounds like for many scientists, based on the letter, there's a lot of pressure to believe the Big Bang, even if your research would call it into question. So they talked about there's not open exchange in mainstream conferences. There's this fear that if you don't support the Big Bang Theory, you might lose your funding. Like, think of it, scientists are funded by people who basically pay them to research. And if that person wants the Big Bang Theory to be true, and your evidence says it's not, how long are they going to keep paying you? Theoretically, we'd like to think, oh, they'll keep paying because they just want the truth. But in reality, that's not maybe always the case. Sometimes, well, not sometimes, all the time, we need to be looking at research and saying, okay, what potential biases are in the group doing the research? Do they have a reason to want to see these results that might make them kind of skew what they're looking at and ignore certain information because they have an agenda they want to fulfill? So that was interesting. Also, this idea that sometimes the Big Bang is used as a filter. So if I do an experiment and whatever I find doesn't line up with the Big Bang Theory, well, then my experiment must be wrong. It can't be the theory. That's totally backwards from the way we normally do science, where my experiment, my observation says this, and so my theory should incorporate that truth, not reject that truth because my theory doesn't work. So that was interesting to me. And finally, this idea of discordant data, disagreements on redshifts and other stuff, the letter says are ignored or even ridiculed. So again, some of these scientific components of the Big Bang Theory, when they are questioned by people, those people, it sounds like, get ignored, not listened to, they get ridiculed and made fun of. It's kind of a way of saying, we don't want to think about that. At least that's the accusation. Now, a few things reflecting on this. I'd love to know what plasma cosmology and the steady state model are. I'd love to know a little bit more about those other competing views. I'd also love to learn more about the evidence of pro-Big Bang Theory bias in the scientific community. It's one thing to say, hey, there's bias. It's another thing for me to see examples of it, right? I don't want to just take this letter and assume that everything it says is absolutely true, although I trust it overall. I'd like to kind of look and say, oh, I see what you're talking about there, and here it pops up that bias, etc. Also, did people respond to this letter? Did those who believe in the Big Bang respond and say, hey, actually, your letter is off here, here, and here? I haven't seen anything. I didn't look that hard. I'm not sure if I really looked at all, to tell you the truth. But it'd be interesting to know. Moving on, though, let's go to, in the beginning God created, or was it a quantum fluctuation? I thought the Genesis 1:1 thing at the beginning was interesting, where it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and it walks through how this is opposed to different religions that have a different view. That was an interesting list. I would like to know a little more about pantheism and panentheism. I sometimes don't quite, it doesn't click for me all the time. Like, how are they different? So I'd like to know a little bit more about that. They made the point that since God never began to exist, he doesn't need a cause like other things do. We'll talk more about that in a minute, so I'll move on for now. They also mentioned the second law of thermodynamics, which is kind of like what we did in our electricity unit, where we're talking about efficiency, right? And the light bulb is on, and it's drawing this much energy, but it's only sending out this much energy as light. The rest is lost to heat. Similarly, in the universe, usable energy gives off normally some form of unusable energy. There's always some kind of energy that's not helpful. So if you clap your hands really hard, really fast for a long time, your hands will get hot. Even though you weren't trying to get them hot, you were just trying to create sound. And that heat energy you've created is lost now. You can't reuse it. It's already happened. Similarly, the universe is constantly giving off energy that becomes less and less usable. It just becomes this kind of heat floating around in space, if you want to think of it that way. And if the universe was infinitely old, so much heat would have been lost, accidentally, if you will, as different processes were going on, that eventually, well, by now, because that's infinity ago, the universe would be at a heat death. That is to say, everything in the universe would be at the exact same temperature. There'd be no difference between my energy and the energy of anything else, and therefore there could be no activity. The entire universe would just be static. That goes a little deeper, but that's hopefully a summary of that concept. We could talk about more sometime if you want to do that, maybe during your call on Monday. We could talk about thermodynamics and the second law of thermodynamics and what it says about the age of the universe. Oh, it did make me ask a question though. How much energy would you have had to have 13.7 billion years ago? Remember, the National Geographic video claims that that's how old the universe is. In order to have the energy that we have right now, like we, from my perspective, have a lot of usable energy. So if we're always losing energy, and we've been losing energy for 13.7 billion years, like just mathematically, how much energy would you have way back then in order to still have all this energy now? I'm not saying that it creates a problem for the theory. I'm just kind of curious as a math guy what that number would be. That's just interesting to me. I don't think it proves it or disproves it, to be clear. What next? Oh, yeah. Nothing is not anything, not a type of something. I really liked in this section how they used secular resources. I think it was a paper that's not a friend of Christianity as they described it. And here's a secular scientist or reviewer of books going after Dr. Lawrence Krauss and saying, look, man, the way you're using the word nothing is not appropriate. It's not accurate. You're using nothing to describe something. That's not a legitimate way to use the word. I think it's helpful when, especially as believers, we can say, hey, look, non-believers agree with us on this one. It's not just our little community with our little thinking that thinks this way. Hey, there are other people who agree with us. The more diverse minds agree about something, there's this kind of intuitive argument that if people from all over in different perspectives agree on this thing, it's more likely to be true than if it's all just the same type of people agree on this thing. Again, it doesn't make it true or not, but it's one helpful argument. I did, though, want to ask, like, how would Dr. Krauss respond? In fairness to him, if someone said, hey, the way you're using the word nothing doesn't actually mean nothing, what would he say in response? How would he defend himself? I think he should have a chance, and the article didn't end up including that. Maybe they didn't reach out to him. They made the point that if the universe is a quantum fluctuation, there must have been something to fluctuate. So, for example, your temperature might fluctuate, it might go up and down, but you have a temperature at all times. That's why it can fluctuate. If you had no temperature whatsoever, it couldn't change, right? It's like changing the style of your car. You have to have a car in order to change it, the style of your car. If you don't have a car, you can't make it red because there's nothing to make red. Similarly, you can't have a quantum fluctuation unless you have something that can fluctuate. Without anything, you can't do something to it. That makes sense? You get what I'm saying. I thought it was really solid overall. There were a few bits that could have used a little more explanation at the beginning, I thought, but a solid article. Next, third last, we're getting there. If God created the universe, then who created God? So I read the article and watched the video, but these notes are from the video. If the universe needs a cause, the video asks, then why doesn't God? And they answer that. They say that because only things that have beginnings need causes, and God didn't have a beginning. The idea, I think, is that if existence is part of God's being, they call it the aseity of God, the self-existence, nothing made him, he just is, then he defies that issue of needing a cause. If God exists in himself, no one made him, he makes himself, if you want to think of it that way. Not that he started at a certain point, but he's just always existed. It's a property he has. Then you don't need something to cause him. Now, this defies our experience of the physical world, but it would be possible for a spiritual, immaterial being. Like, physical things can't just cause themselves, right? If I see a banana on my plate, I don't think that, it just popped out of nowhere. I think there's a cause, something made it. But immaterial, spiritual things may be able to do that. Logically, you can see how that would happen. Similarly, the idea that the physical universe is eternal defies logic, because nothing in our universe can cause itself to exist. Right? We have to go and put energy into making things and creating things, and whether that's something from a baby being made by a mom and dad, or whether that's something like us creating a piece of furniture, or whether it's whatever kind of product we might want to make, we have to do something to create that thing. There's a cause and an effect. That's how the physical world works. So we need something non-physical to create the universe, and God, being a non-physical thing, doesn't have to have a cause that way. They mention that matter, space, and time are a package deal, and so that you can't have had time before the universe began. I'd just like to know a little bit more about what they mean. In what way are matter, time, and space a package deal? How does that work? What's the science and the physics behind that? I was curious. They do make a good point, I think, about how our experiences as time-bound creatures make it hard for us to wrap our heads around what it would be like for there to be no time, or for God to exist forever. One of these things, even as I talk about how an immaterial spiritual being wouldn't have to have a cause, is we don't see that. Everything else in our universe doesn't work that way. And we experience time. So how can there be an uncreated, timeless being? It's, in one sense, we don't have a category for it, right? It's almost as though you were kind of like colorblind and you only saw, 3 colors, so to speak, or shades. I don't really know how colorblindness works, and that's becoming very apparent right now, but that's okay. But imagine you were colorblind and you only knew a very limited set of colors. How could you imagine what purple is, or what violet is, or what macaroni and cheese colored crayons look like if you only have, green and, I don't know, yellow as the colors that you see the world in? You couldn't possibly understand those things because you just are so limited by what you can see. I think similarly, we're limited. We only understand so much. We're so time bound. We don't get eternity. We're so physical. We don't get the spiritual, at least not naturally. We have a spirit, mind you, but we have this physical body that we see every day. So to think of a spiritual being, a timeless being, it's just hard. It's just hard. And I think that's something for us to acknowledge. They talked about the oscillating theory of big bangs, big crunches. They mentioned several issues. I won't get into that, but you can rewatch the video if you want to see some of the issues with that particular version of the Big Bang, which in one sense is what it is the Big Bang theory, but big bang, big crunch, big bang, big crunch, big bang, big crunch. Say that 10 times fast. They brought on that one doctor, look, a scientist who has his doctorate, I should say, to talk about how quantum physics exhibits repeatable, reliable phenomena. Like you can test and observe it and trust it'll do the same thing each time. It's their point in that, and I think it's a helpful one to mention, is that these things can be predicted. It's not some magical, unpredictable entity where quantum physics just does random things out of nothing. There's actually a rhyme and reason to it. It has laws, it has rules, it has guidelines, like everything else in the universe. It's not nothing. It's something that works a certain way. Lastly, from this video, I wanted to talk for a moment about simultaneous creation. The idea that the first moment of time is the moment of God's creative act and of creation simultaneously coming to be. The idea here is, how can you have creation or a causation? How can you make something happen if there's no time? Normally, like I press a button on my keyboard and the thing shows up within a split second. Time helps cause, then create effect. If there's no time, how can you have cause and effect? Because you can't say like God did something here and then this happened if there's no time yet to describe the this and then. So what they're saying, I think, is that the very first moment of time was when God created. He creates the universe and time starts. And so in that moment, he's kind of kicking off time. And so while there was no time up until God decides, as God decides, time is something that's created. And that creation now has time in which you can see cause and effect as God creates everything in that universe. We could go deeper into this. It's probably worth its own video, but I hope it makes at least some sense. And by the way, when I say that God decides, I don't mean he suddenly decided to make the universe. I mean when he chooses to act, at that point, he is both creating something and creation is coming to be at the same moment. And then from there, what we see is when you do something, then the effect happens. It's kind of a unique situation at the very beginning that as God speaks, as God creates, things happen simultaneously and now time exists. Maybe that is more confusing than what you had already heard, but I've tried. I don't pretend to be an expert in these things. I know some things. I've studied some science in university and so on, chemistry, some physics, etc. But hey, I'm okay to admit that I don't have everything figured out. And I've been learning as you've been learning during this time. Second last, The video, Big Bang Exploding the Myth. He talked about cosmological evolution as a third phase of evolution. I read, I think somewhere else outside of this research, that maybe that's not the greatest representation, that people who believe in the Big Bang Theory wouldn't consider it cosmological evolution, or at least not the very origin, that they would say that's a separate issue. So it doesn't really matter for our purposes. But I thought, you know what, we would like others to use proper terminology when speaking about us. So I thought it was worth pointing out, hey, we need to be mindful when we're speaking to others about the origin of the universe. Hey, I want to use words that we're on the same page about and that you feel accurately represent what you think, believe, and hold to. I think he made some helpful points about biases. Atheism and atheistic science assume two things. One, nature and matter are all that exist. Two, time, chance, and the laws of nature can explain everything. So they're naturally then going to assume there's no God here doing anything. And whatever we see can be explained without a God, partly because there is no God to explain it with. On the other hand, Christian science assumes that one, there is a holy God who's eternal and good and all-knowing and all-powerful, and he created everything. And so it assumes there is a God who can be the explanation for some things we see. And secondly, it assumes that God wrote the Bible and that the Bible is reliable, that we can use the Bible as a source of scientific information as long as we're rightly reading and interpreting it. So you can see how that would bring atheistic science and Christian science to different perspectives if on one, God isn't even a possibility, and the other, God is not just a possibility, but he's a reliable possibility. They talked for a bit about observational and operational science versus origin science, the idea of what can I test today versus what am I looking back in history at, where I can't go back and test the origin of the universe to go witness it with my own eyes. But I can test gravity today, like I can drop this cup. There, gravity still works. I have now tested that. If you want me to test the origin of the universe, I don't know what I would do. I can't go back. And I think that's a helpful distinction. Helps us understand this debate that when we're talking about the origins of the universe, we need to think a little differently than we're talking about whether gravity exists today. Because we're looking back into the past and we're making somewhat educated guesses on both sides as we're trying to look at what we see now and say, if this is happening now, that probably happened then. It's like driving up to an intersection and seeing a car totaled, right beside a telephone pole. Now, you see that, you weren't there to watch whatever happened. You would probably assume it ran into the telephone pole. But really, for all you know, someone just has a really beat up car and they parked it beside the telephone pole. Or they lightly hit the telephone pole and then someone came along and beat up their car. Maybe they were escaping from someone and that person came and totaled their car after with a sledgehammer. These things sound silly, but we don't know what happened. We just look at the present thing and project into the past. This is what's most likely. And that's what happens with origin science. Whether you're a creation scientist or whether you're a kind of an atheistic scientist, you're taking things we can see now and saying, okay, if this is what's happening now, this is what probably happened in the past. And that's a lot different than, oh, look, gravity works. So that's helpful as we think about it, just to know on both sides, we are making some projections of information where to kind of explain this is how what's happening now explains what used to happen. Whereas with other types of science, we're just looking at it in real time. They mentioned the Scientific American headline, Quantum Gaps in the Big Bang Theory. I just find it interesting when you don't hear a lot in the media about secular scientists questioning the Big Bang Theory, but it clearly does happen in what seems to be a respected journal. Scientific American sounds like one of those respected journals. They took issue with inflation was one thing, and I wrote down here, I'd just like to know a bit more about what they mean by inflation. They're not talking about money, obviously. They're talking about the universe. I'd love to know more what they mean by that and what the issue with it is as part of the Big Bang Theory. They also made the point that if the universe really is expanding, that doesn't mean it started at a single point. That just means it started smaller. That's all you know, right? Just like to say that, that a car is at the end of Wellington Street here in St. Thomas. It doesn't mean that it started at the beginning. It may have turned on halfway through. Similarly, the size of the universe, if the universe is expanding, must have been smaller than it is now at some point. But that doesn't mean it goes all the way back necessarily. It may have been started at a certain size and then grown a little. And I'm curious, I wrote down one of my questions. What evidence do we have, if any, to tell us whether we should trace that all the way back to nothing or whether we should trace it only back to a certain point? I'd just be curious to know if people have studied that and tried to, make best guesses about that. Obviously, I have my Bible, which would make me think that, as I read it, that the universe starts at a certain size, and if it's growing, is growing from that size, not from singularity. But I'd be curious to know more about this, what science has turned up. One more thought on here. I was just curious as I listened to this, what would it take for science to move to more inclusive conversation about origins? By inclusive, I mean different viewpoints coming together and having reasonable conversations about the origin of the universe, instead of just, these people have their program and these people have their program and you can't get the Big Bang Theory in here and no creationists allowed in this area. I think we'd be a lot better off if we would talk to one another. We'd understand one another better and move towards truth. And I'm not afraid of that. I believe all truth is God's truth, and I believe if we have those conversations, they will lead us to God if we're having them without bias and sincerely. Anyways, honestly, that video wasn't my favorite resource, that video wasn't my favorite resource, but it's not saying it was bad, and it just wasn't the most convincing of the ones we saw. All right, now on to the last one. Let's take a quick look at our time. 41 minutes. Okay, we'll get this through and get you out of here within the next 10 minutes. Life, the universe, and nothing. Why is there something rather than nothing? So this is a debate between Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. Lawrence Krauss. And I actually watched the whole thing. It was interesting. And so here's some points from it. Dr. Krauss talked about that we should learn from the universe and accept what it tells us, whether we like it or not. And I think he's right. We study and do science, and what the universe is telling us, we need to accept. We need to accept reality, if you will. However, I will say, I think he fails to mention, one, that we bring biases to that study. And so sometimes what we think the universe is saying is not what it's actually saying. I'd argue that a lot of Big Bang Theory comes from that sort of misinterpretation based on bias. Secondly, we need to understand that we are fallible. In other words, we're just simply not smart enough to always rightly interpret the evidence that we're getting. And so we need to kind of be open to the idea that, hey, maybe what I thought that was pointing to is not what it's pointing to. That would be a second point about that. Nothing in the Bible, according to Krauss, is an infinite void, which is actually a boiling brew of particles popping into and out of existence. I don't know what to say about that. I don't understand where he got that idea from. Now, I think he's a Jewish guy. I think so. He probably grew up learning the Torah, the Old Testament, if you will, and maybe that's his interpretation of Genesis chapter 1. But the idea that nothing in the Bible is this boiling brew of particles popping into and out of existence doesn't seem to square with what the Bible is actually saying. The Bible seems to be talking about creation ex nihilo, which means creation out of nothing. And that's been something that Christians have believed for centuries. So where he's getting that idea from, I couldn't tell you. He also claims that quantum mechanics can get you a universe from nothing, although as we've seen, that doesn't seem to work, and I'm not sure that he made a convincing argument for it. Then came Dr. Craig. He had his time to talk. He said that nothing means not anything. You can't refer to a physical reality as nothing. We've talked about that you can't say the quantum vacuum is nothing because it's something. And then I liked how he turned the question around to make it a little more clear. Why does anything exist at all? Or why does anything at all exist, I guess was his actual words. I think that's helpful. And I think it reminds us that in conversation, definitions matter. Terms matter. The questions we're asking, how they're worded matter. If we're going to have productive conversation, we need to make sure we're being accurate and precise in how we use words. Dr. Craig went on to say that everything that exists has an explanation. Either it's necessary to its own nature that it exists, like it just is because it is, or it was caused to exist. It is because it was made. He then went on to say that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God or God. By God or God, I mean lower G or bigger G. Basically, what he's saying is only an abstract object or unembodied person could create the universe. To create physical reality, you need something outside of it. And since abstract objects don't do things, like the number 7 doesn't do something, it must be this unembodied person. And I think that's what he means by God. I know Dr. Krauss tries to kind of push back on that. But I think the argument holds if admittedly Dr. Craig could have spent more time explaining exactly what he means. I think he means there must be some kind of godlike creator if the universe has a cause, because only someone with those qualities could create this universe, or any universe for that matter. I liked his translucent ball illustration, Dr. Craig's translucent ball illustration, where if you see a ball, you say, how to get here? You never just assume it just popped out of nothing. And the universe, in one sense, is just a really big ball, if you want to think of it that way. And so the question should still be how to get here, not just assuming, oh, it came out of nothing. No, the size of the ball doesn't change the question. Car size, tennis ball size, we still, if we saw it in the middle of nowhere, would assume that it got there somehow, not just that it popped into existence. So I thought that was a fair point about the universe, using that analogy. Now, at one point, Dr. Craig said that if the universe has an explanation, atheism can't be true. And I'm not quite sure I understand what he means by that, but I'm also not sure I agree with what I think he means by it. I mean, the universe's explanation, theoretically, could be that it just popped out of nothing. And atheism could still be true with that explanation. Maybe he's using the idea that if the universe has an explanation, there must be a God, and therefore atheism can't be true. That's something that's just coming to me right now. And if that's his point, then sure, I get what he's saying. But I wasn't quite sure exactly what he meant. Again, the point is not that atheism is true. The point is I'm not sure that particular argument was as precise as it could have been. And I'm not quite sure where it goes. He also mentioned the qualities of a creator again, transcending time and space and being uncaused and immaterial and personal. Then a few last thoughts. Krauss says, in his opinion, it's more likely than not that the universe had a beginning. That was neat to hear him say. And he did say at one point that you can have a physical explanation for the universe. But what he seems to mean is you can have a multiverse. And one of the multiverses created our universe. But that doesn't solve the question, even if there were a multiverse. It actually just kind of pushes the problem up a level to say, okay, so our universe came from the multiverse. But where did the physical multiverse come from? At some point, you need a non-physical explanation. That's inescapable as I see it. And so, although what he said maybe sounded somewhat plausible, it actually just kind of avoids the question, really, in the end. Two final notes. One, they talked a bit towards the end about how theology is queen of the sciences, or at least Dr. Craig believes it is. And yet, God isn't subject to science. And Dr. Krauss said, what do you mean? How can theology, the study of God, be the queen of the sciences if God isn't subject to science, if you can't use science to study God? And I think what they're talking about, as Dr. Craig kind of got into, are two different ways of using the word science. One is the idea that theology gives us the worldview that we can use to do science. What I know about God tells me I have an ordered world where I can expect predictable results when God's letting things work according to the laws he's created, not intervening with them. That's kind of theology, queen of the sciences. It helps me with all the other sciences, and all the other sciences teach me things about God. On the other hand, God isn't subject to science in the sense that I can't use science to study the immaterial spiritual world. I can't, take out some kind of I don't have anything here, but some kind of monitor device, right? Like an ammeter, for example, and measure God's electricity. If God's not physical, he doesn't have electricity, right? I can't take God's weight and measure him that way. He's immaterial. He doesn't have a mass. So in that sense, God isn't subject to science. You can't study him. So I guess to bring it down, you can learn things about God from science, but you can't study God directly because he's not physical, and science can only study that which is physical. So we can see what God has done in creation, in people's lives. We can use that scientific study to understand things about God, but we can't study God's holiness scientifically in the sense of, measuring it on a scale. That's, I think, how the words are being used. One last note on this. I thought it was interesting the way they handled themselves. I thought Dr. Craig just exemplified peace, patience, charity, for the most part, anyways. And Dr. Krauss, on the other hand, at one point the crowd kind of roars and erupts with cheering when the moderator basically tells him to zip it. Um, just a thought that reminded me that when we talk to people about these things, wherever we land, we need to be gracious and charitable as Jesus is, showing that character in the conversation and helping people to feel the love of Christ, even if we disagree with them. Now, again, there's going to be a link below in the description if you want to. Did my hands get up on the screen? I don't know. This entire time I can't tell. So now, there are my hands. I'm sure on the screen. The description, link below. And that'll give you all the notes that I took as I took them. I've given you a bit of a summary here and kind of gone over, 4 or 5 hours of work in under an hour here. Hopefully it's helpful. On Monday, we're going to chat for just half an hour. It's going to be a bit of a, hey, good to see you, have a great summer kind of chat, but also bring your questions, bring your concerns, bring things you've learned. Let's just chat about it. I don't know where the conversation is going to go. I don't have a checklist I want to get through. I just want to talk and get a sense of what this has been like for you, where you're at, and have an honest conversation and a kind of a safe place to talk about what you really think about all of this. One last thought. I meant to mention this at the beginning of the video. Why am I in here? Why am I filming in here? I have been working real hard this week, in my mind, to get us ready for live streaming as a church on Sunday. We're hoping to have in-person services. By the time you see this, I will know whether we did it or not, because I'm filming this on Friday the 12th or whatever today is. But I just thought this is where I've been all week. It's a different spot. So I just wanted to kind of say, hey, here's what my life's look like right now. Working with computers, learning to live stream, learning sound, stuff I'd never done before. It's been kind of interesting. So little glimpse into what I've been up to. I'd love to hear from you always. Feel free to shoot me a message on Google Hangouts, or if you want to connect with me via email or whatever, that's all cool. And man, I am still hoping it sooner rather than later we can be together in person. So I'm going to switch over to the recording now so that I can end this. 52 minutes. You are troopers. Thanks for sticking with me. If you've made it all the way through, I hope it's been worth your while. Would love some feedback, and looking forward to chatting with you on Monday. Bye now.